ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Today it's the story of two sisters, Josie and Dorothy. Along with their middle sister Mary, the girls grew up in an always interesting, though often volatile home on the northern beaches of Sydney, with lots of books and a backyard menagerie of animals. Josie adored her charismatic big sister, with her wicked sense of humour, her appetite for life and her fierce talent. But Josie took a very different path from Dorothy. Dorothy ran headlong into bohemian adventures and became the rarest of things in Australia, a famous poet. While Josie, to her sister's dismay, became a born-again Christian, submitting herself to the male authority of the evangelical church for many years. Dorothy Porter published acclaimed poetry collections and the genre-busting lesbian detective verse crime novel The Monkey's Mask, a book which was lauded around the world and turned into a film. Dorothy died at just 54, and years on, Josie has written her own version of the family story, paying tribute to the way her life was shaped by her wild and magnetic sister. The memoir is called Gutsy Girls, Love, Poetry and Sisterhood. Hi, Josie.
Hi, Sarah.
Now, I'm calling you Josie and your sister Dorothy, but what was Dorothy's nickname for you as a kid?
Well, it started off Sweet Wah in charge. And
Sweet Wah.
Sweet Wah with several A's in the middle. I was her junior by 6 years and by all accounts was very whiny and whingy and annoying. I even have a letter in kind of very babyish writing signed by myself as Sweet Wah in charge to Dorothy when she was away at a camp. But that morphed into Brat, and I was Brat for many years. And then as we aged, it became Bratlet, and at the end of her life I was Brattle, always Brattle.
And what did you call her?
Dodd. I called her Dodd or Doddy. All the family called her Dodd or Doddy. Her friends always knew her as Dot, but we always called her Doddy.
And what are your earliest memories of her? You say 6 years apart.
Well, I do remember being in a cot and seeing her standing over the cot with a light behind her head. So it's quite a strong memory. And she was always delighted in me as a baby. It was a lovely memory, and she was sort of giggling and I was giggling back at her. So I don't know how old I was, pretty young.
Did you look alike?
Look, people tell us that we look very much alike. We both looked like our paternal grandmother. We both looked like her. I think as I'm aging, I'm sort of looking more like her, but also more like my mother. You know that feeling when you catch your face in a mirror and think, oh, God, it's my mother. So
I do.
That is definitely happening. But yes, we are alike. And my middle sister, Mary, who's 4 years older than me, is very unlike Dorothy and I. I am, short and, you know, a bit stocky, and Mary is tall and blonde and blue-eyed. I'm dark. So we're quite different.
So as the eldest of these three girls, was Dorothy in charge of your adventures as you grew up?
Totally. I mean, 6 years is, I think it's a great age gap because there's no competition and there's no rivalry. You know, she's the boss, she's in charge, and Dodd was always interesting. And we grew up with a lot of pets. Any request for a pet, my father said yes to. I did the same with my own children, and my son does the same with his children. But we had lots and lots of pets. And Dorothy was always very good at making up adventures, and she had very intriguing, interesting toys. Now, of course, retrospectively, those toys weren't that intriguing and interesting, but she wouldn't let us touch them or play with them. So they were interesting, you know, for that reason.
She even wore a captain's hat at one point in her childhood.
She did. She wore that hat for years. And she had her 2 plaits hanging down the back, and she wore this cap with this kind of authorial air and was just in charge. And Mary will agree with me, we just did what she told us to do.
So a classic eldest child of your parents, Jean and Chester. Tell me what was happening in Jean's life before she met Chester. What sort of young woman was she?
Well, this is an intriguing story about my mother. She was unmarried in her 20s, in her late 20s, and it was the 50s. And nobody was unmarried in the 50s. Well, if they were considered on the shelf and an old maid. So she and her best friend headed off to Europe for adventures. And she was a science teacher, so she taught science in London at some really wild schools. And she also lived in Spain. And the big adventure she had in Spain is that she fell in love with a man called Paco. And Paco was a lawyer and clever and witty and urbane and apparently very attractive, although I have seen photos of Paco and I'm not convinced, but anyway, he had something. And Jean and Paco were engaged. Anyway, Jean trundled along with this relationship until it became apparent that he was also, well, let's face it, a misogynist, and said to Jean, once we get married, there'll be no contraception and that's your life, and you also aren't allowed to work. And Jean had enough guts and, forewarning, if you like, that this would be a miserable life for her. And so she came home and in very short order married Chester.
Why did she choose him, do you think?
Well, it's my theory, but I do think it was a rebound kind of relationship. And Chester was very keen on Jean, and Jean thought, look, she's never going to have children if she doesn't get on with it. And so they were married.
And where did they set up home together, Josie?
In Mona Vale. It's the northern beaches of Sydney. And when they were in Mona Vale, it was very much market gardens and greenhouses, and it was the sort of the lungs of Sydney. And there was Pittwater and Bayview and mud flats to explore. It was not developed. It's not the Mona Vale of today.
What were things like inside the house? Was it meeting the standards of those sort of 1950s and 60s suburban ideals?
Not really. Jean was never much of a proud housewife type. Look, my mother was fiercely intelligent, and she also taught as a science teacher. She started teaching part-time from when I was in 3rd class. But no, Jean just couldn't be bothered with any of that. It used to drive me crazy as a kid. She used to open packets of biscuits and then just leave them open. Everything was stale, everything was full of weevils. Jean couldn't care less.
Your mum and dad both loved being in the garden. What kind of figure did your dad cut as he worked out in the yard on the weekends? What would he wear?
Kind of bizarre, even by the standards of the 60s, I think. He used to put on those sort of boxer short swimming costumes, trunks, and then he had a big belt around his waist with a big giant knife attached to the belt, and he'd always have a fag hanging out of his mouth, because, everybody smoked back then, and he would, be pacing around his duckyard because they had 3 blocks of land, and so he had ducks and geese and chalks and bantams and guinea pigs and rabbits and a big pond full of tortoises. There was a lot going on in that yard.
There were lots of wild birds as well as the birds that your dad helped raise as pets. What sort of relationship did Dorothy have with birds?
Well, when we were kids, we used to get dragged on bushwalks and dragged out birdwatching and, sit beside some dam in the sun staring at ducks in the distance. I mean, absolutely shocking. We'd rather sit in the car and play cards than watch those bloody birds. And it was excruciatingly boring. And the irony is that as we aged, Dorothy and I discovered an absolute shared love for birdwatching.
Which is definitely something you inherited from your dad.
Definitely.
What holidays would he take your mum on each year for birds?
He insisted on taking Jean away for at least 2 weeks every year. And look, they wouldn't go anywhere that you would consider particularly exotic. They weren't going to Costa Rica because Chester was plagued by anxiety and IBS. They'd never go anywhere. So they'd go to Bathurst in the west of New South Wales. They'd go to, I don't think they went further than parks or...
But to look at birds?
Oh, yes. And do you know what? That is one of my favourite things now. Oh, my word. Who knew?
Who would look after you and your sisters when your mum and dad were off looking at birds in Bathurst?
Well, I just don't know what Jean was thinking, but she would just ask around and say, was there anybody who could come and mind the girls? And these women would come and mind us, and they were unbelievable. They would just come with no recommendation and not cook, lie in bed.
So not Mary Poppins types.
No. And, I remember being in the bath and one would sit on the toilet loudly defecating while you was in the bath. It was horrible. And I was appalled and I was just desperate for Mum to come home.
And would you confide what had happened to your mum when she came back?
Oh, yes. And she'd say, oh dear, oh, well. And then next year we seemed to get somebody different and somebody worse.
When your dad wasn't wearing his swimming togs with a knife attached and working in the garden, he was a barrister. What sort of reputation did he have in the courtroom?
Well, Chester Porter had a formidable reputation. Probably one of the best-known silks, I think, in this country. Look, he was a remarkable advocate and he was involved in some very well-known cases, probably most significantly the exoneration of Lindy Chamberlain, that Royal Commission. He was extremely upright and honest and committed in his work. He wouldn't tolerate any form of corruption or dishonesty. He was known as the Smiling Funnel Web, which was an extraordinary moniker. Well, I think like a kind of a spider, you would be cross-examined by him, in the witness box and you would be happily answering questions and going along with it until you realised that you were stung most severely by the funnel web because you were hoisted by your own petard, as they say.
So these qualities that made him an excellent defence barrister, how did they translate to family life, to the domestic setting?
Well, I think he was very stressed all the time by this work. And I was going to study law, and I think just seeing the stress that he was under was a real deterrent for me because he also suffered from this crippling IBS and he used to swig from a bottle called The Mixture, must have been mixed up by the chemist, this foul sort of grey concoction which we realised in later life was mostly codeine. So he was swigging this codeine down to control his IBS, which really was not a good cure. So I think there was a chronic pain and stress associated with this. And then when he would come home, I think his demons erupted.
So he could be a volatile presence at home, or what was he like in that space?
Look, he was very volatile, and anybody who's grown up in a household that's got a level of instability will know what I'm talking about, that it's not necessarily that there are incidents and rages every 5 minutes or even daily. Sometimes it's weeks, but you know that it could happen at any time. And so the atmosphere was often very difficult at home, particularly when he would lose something. So he would lose his National Geographic, or he would lose his pen, or he couldn't find his newspaper. And he would start saying who hid it and, you're all just, this is a house of bitches I live in. There was a huge amount of verbal abuse that would happen at this point, and then there'd be an eruption and we would all be very, very frightened.
Could he be violent, Josie?
Well, there's all different types of violence, isn't there? Certainly there were smacks. My sister Mary tells me that I got off let lightly because I didn't really get that many smacks, but there were smacks, as they were called. But I don't think this was unusual in the 60s and 70s. But I think that the thing that was most disturbing for us was that rising temperature, the shouting. Once he, broke every glass. It's that kind of thing that really scares children and obviously scared Jean. And it was so unpredictable, and it would be often triggered by the smallest thing.
What role did your mum take when those eruptions, as you described them, were happening?
Well, I was upset with my mother for many years because I felt that she didn't stand up to him the way I wanted her to. And again, I think that, I'm not alone in this, that sometimes as children in households like this, we want our mothers to do more. And it's only now, as I'm older, that I realise she did her best. And we did discuss this when I was writing the book. Both my parents have died. We did discuss this, Jean and I. And when she was 95, she actually apologised to me for not doing more. But she had real fears about doing more, as lots of women do. She had real fears that he would drive off and take his own life, which he threatened to do on many occasions. She felt that if she sided with us, that it could be inflammatory and he could get a whole lot worse. So she engaged in those time-honoured practices of placating and appeasing and mollifying and trying to calm him down, and mostly telling us to shut up.
What about Dorothy, this admired big sister who was the boss of the three of you? Would she stand up to your dad?
Look, she did, and she did often. And I think she paid a pretty high price for it. She did see that as her role, to try and protect both Jean and her younger sisters, and she did stand up to him almost all the time. On one occasion, and this may have happened more than once, but I certainly remember on one occasion where they were kind of in a scuffle on the floor, where she was hitting him and he was hitting her. It was just terrible, but she did take it upon herself to try and protect us. And I thought, that was amazing, and I loved her more for it.
One place that she found something of an escape from what was going on at home was at Camp Howard. What was Camp Howard?
Well, Camp Howard became the Anglican Youth Department, and then it became Youth Works. I think it's still called Youth Works. And these were Christian camps that kids went on, and, there was plenty of outdoor activities and fun, but there was also a very serious side, and that was to hear the good news of Jesus. And Dod went off to these camps with her mates from school, and she really liked them. They weren't expensive, so there were kids from all different parts of Sydney and New South Wales, not from particularly well-to-do families, and they had an absolute ball. They were all girls' camps. There was no mixed camps, no men.
Did she have crushes on teachers during that time?
Dod was legendary in her crushes. When I was writing this book, I had a whole chapter in an earlier draft just called Crushes, and I documented them from the earliest ones for when she was like less than 10, all of them, until it just became a list. So that's not in the book anymore, but there were many, and I think they were really fired up at Camp Howard. She started going when she was 10, and she used to go every year, sometimes twice a year. And the counsellors, as they were known as, were really not much older than the kids. So she absolutely loved it, and she had many crushes on lots of different women and girls at these camps.
So you would have heard her talking about this and her going off to this exciting place. Do you remember when you became old enough to go for the first time, Josie? How did that feel?
I was so excited. I was so excited. And Mary was never very interested in going because she thought it sounded like there were too many Bible studies occurring. Wise. But I went off, and I think because I was the youngest in the family, of course this is all with much hindsight and reflecting as an older person, because I was feeling left out at home and the baby, and was I special enough? I go off to this camp where everybody makes a fuss of you. These lovely young women are making a giant fuss of you, and you're sitting down doing these Bible studies and open the door of your heart to Jesus, and, Jesus knocks at the door, open up. So, of course, I did.
Do you remember that moment?
I sure do.
What happened? How did it feel?
I remember the counsellor out the front, her name was Zip, because everybody had these funny little nicknames, and Zip said it, and down I went, down the front, my first come to Jesus moment. There would be many more. And I thought, I'm in, I'm saved, I'm doing the right thing. And it offered me a lot at that time. So I came home, told everybody, told Jean you're not a proper Christian because you're not reading the Bible, to her great indignation.
What did your sisters make of this conversion, especially Dorothy, who'd been to the camp but had been more interested in the counsellors than Jesus?
Head in hands. Poor Dodd, to see her little sister caught up in this. Dodd always resisted the conversions. She always just kept that apart. And over the years, because she went for so many years, there were so many attempts to convert her. And her diaries are full of these incidents where she was kind of clashing quite seriously with some of these counsellors who would argue with her, but Dodd gave as good as she got, and she never went down that road. She just fell in love with the women. Well, once I got to university, it became bigger and stronger and more heated and more serious. From day one of enrolling at university, I was sort of approached by somebody at O Week from the campus Bible study desk and said, would I like to sign up? I was a Christian. I thought, right, I will. So I signed up, but then I was really in. So I would go to campus Bible study. I was a cell group leader. I would take copious notes at all these Bible studies, sometimes once or twice a week. I took it all extremely seriously. And it was a fairly fundamentalist faith, I believe, retrospectively.
What kind of place did women have in that church, that religious group that you became a part of?
Women were in a permanently subordinate role, and that was considered as revealed by God in the pages of the Bible. It wasn't called this at university. It was latterly called equal but different. Look, it was anything but equal, but it was certainly different. And the women were, they were the sort of the handmaidens of the men. And I was invited to join a ministry training scheme, and just some moment of clarity, I think, I said no, because women at that time weren't paid while the men were paid. We had to raise our own funds. We were never considered serious contenders because, after all, women were just going to get married and have babies anyway, so how could you ever be a leader? And, you couldn't assume that mantle anyway because it's against God's purposes. So I didn't. I said no to that offer, sort of poison chalice really, and embarked on my social work career.
You met your husband, James, around this time too. What drew you to him?
Well, my sister Mary organised a blind date, and she said to me, you know, he is the same awful brand of Christianity as you. God bless her.
The best.
And so I thought, oh, well, maybe, who knows? So we were on a blind date and we did like each other incredibly. And we were both interested in music and bands, and we'd both done the band thing. And, you know, he'd come from a very religious background, much more than myself. And he was scared that he would be left behind when the rapture came. He had one of these terrible kind of conversion experiences by fear. Anyway, we got together and got married and still together, miraculously.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Konoski.
What did Dorothy make of all this, of your increasingly evangelical faith and your marriage at still a young age? How did she respond?
Well, look, this was all part of the Christian shtick. You know, you got married young because sex before marriage was forbidden. And so everybody was getting engaged at these very tender ages. And look, Dodd was horrified. And rightly so. My parents, I think, were horrified.
Did she and you talk about it explicitly, or was it more just something you understood she'd disapprove of?
We didn't talk explicitly. She was pretty caught up in her own love life at this point.
Well, what was happening with her?
Well, Dodd was sort of closeted at this point, and she was living with her girlfriend, and they were living in an open relationship where the two of them were having relationships with men, but they were also together. And I think navigating that was very difficult for her. You know, this is kind of 70s and 80s, and it was very secret. None of us knew. We thought her girlfriend was her flatmate, and I think she was entirely preoccupied and left Mary and I to get on with our own kind of vexed love lives.
What happened in her life then to kind of lead to this public coming out to the world and to your parents?
Dorothy fell head over heels in love with another one of her students by the name of Lynn Hughes. Lynn Hughes is a writer now and was a budding writer then, and I think that was the real deal. And once she fell for Lynn, that was when she came out. And she came out absolutely. And she said to Jean and Chester, from this day on, you will tell everybody. It's not a secret. So she sat while Jean rang her mother, her sisters, her friends, and said, Dorothy is in a relationship with Lynn and she's gay, and that's that.
How did your dad react?
Well, look, my parents were pretty good about this. Mum cried at first, and she said to me, was it something I've done? And I said, no, of course not. That's ridiculous. And Mum was a bit upset at first because she thought Dorothy's not going to have children. But she knew. She just knew that this was who Dodd was. And my father was very accepting. He was not voyeuristic. He was not curious. He was very accepting of it. So full credit to my parents.
What about you and your thinking at that time, Josie? I mean, what was the attitude to gay people in the church that you were a part of?
Well, in the quest for being brutally honest, I was a part of a group that was involved in deconversion of people who were gay. I don't mean by aversive electrical techniques, but certainly by prayer and counselling. And there was the Pray the Gay Away. I was involved in that group.
Before you knew about your sister?
Oh, absolutely. And during. But there was an enormous ethical incongruence for me. And, what we might call a cognitive dissonance, because when Dorothy came out, I was absolutely okay. I kind of knew this was who she was. And so that set up for me an enormous challenge. Here was my gay sister who I loved and admired. I hero worshipped her. Her work was, changing lives. And I thought being gay was against God's plan. I think I thought, well, she'll get converted and then she won't be gay anymore. I mean, the naivety and the foolishness and also the harmfulness of this kind of thinking. And I think in subsequent years, we were at our lowest point, Dot and I.
She was really making her name as a writer, as a poet in this period. How was the public responding to her work?
Well, the thing is about Dodd's work is that it's so bold and so wild and so accessible that people were reading it and noticing it. She wasn't writing obscure little verses that nobody knew what the hell she was talking about. And people were reading and buying her books.
What about as a performer? What was she like when she was reciting her poetry?
She was an amazing performer and she loved it. She loved it. And she was starting to get a name as an outstanding performer of her work. And she used to read out her poems and people were going mad and clapping, and
she had a rock star energy to her. She doesn't look like a traditional poet.
And she loved the fangirls that loved her. She loved them. And, full credit to her. I mean, how many poets have fangirls and people writing fan mail? And people did love her. And she was also very outrageous and she broke taboos. I think she would even be considered a bit of a rule breaker now.
Her big breakthrough was The Monkey's Mask. Tell me about that work.
Well, she said she wrote The Monkey's Mask just for the sheer hell of it. I just think she thought, I'm going to just see if I can write something really different. She was always a big fan of detective novels, loved a puzzle. And so she thought she'd do that in verse. And of course, it has this wildly erotic lesbian love affair at the heart of it. And it is funny and outrageous, and it's got quite a great puzzle in it. A whodunit.
How did she feel about it being made into a movie, which doesn't happen to many poems?
It sure doesn't. Look, when it was made into a movie, I think she was on cloud nine. She thought that she would be rich. She thought that we'd all be rich. And that this would be, win Academy Awards. And look, as it turned out, it certainly didn't win Academy Awards, but it was a fun movie with Susie Porter playing the mug lesbian detective and Kelly McGillis playing the wildly erotic seductress Diana.
Let's hear from Dorothy herself. This is your sister reading one of her idiosyncratic love poems.
Giant squid. I dreamt last night that I lay naked at the bottom of a soft black sea in the many loving arms of a giant squid. Our strange, mutually enraptured breathing in perfect unison as we nibbled on each other's preciously alien faces. At the back of my purring mind was an itch for a camera to show the world my lover, my monster mollusk, truly existed. But in my dream, I didn't move. There was a terrific tranquility in just lying still and not proving anything.
That's Dorothy Porter reading Giant Squid from her 2002 verse novel Wild Surmise. What's it like to hear her voice, Josie?
Sounds like my own. It's kind of a little startling. She made lots of recordings for the ABC and both radio and television. I love hearing her read her poems and I love hearing her voice.
So Dorothy was there creating this big public life, as you say, one of the rarest things in Australia, a famous poet. You were growing older yourself, going into your own life. You had children of your own. How were you feeling about the teachings of this evangelical Christianity that you were a part of, particularly as it related to women?
Well, I was just increasingly distressed and dismayed. You know, I felt I was defending the indefensible. And when you start experiencing that kind of incongruence within yourself, it's very unnerving and just threw me completely. And anybody who's deconstructed from a religious faith knows that it takes a very long time because you have so much invested. All your friends are there, your money, your time, your whole belief system. The grief and the wrench of leaving is incalculable, and you don't think you can do it.
Was there an incident that made you choose to leave, or was it something that was a growing kind of evolution?
Look, there were many incidents. It's a cumulative thing when you leave the church. I know there are some people that there might be some wild, startling incident, but most people, and in my counselling work, which I talk with a lot of people now with religious trauma, it's a slow process of multiple occasions, micro injuries, where you experience a sense of dissonance, distress, alienation, ostracism. And I think many of us cultivate another life below the surface of our evangelical life. I certainly did.
What was this other life?
It's buried. It's a life that you do not dare own up to. It's the life that says there is no hell, that women are not permanently subordinate to men, that there is nothing wrong with people's diverse sexual choices and identity. It's the one that confronts and challenges all of those beliefs, and it just quietly sits there, and you dare not acknowledge it because of the implications. The loss of friendships, the loss of marriages.
Was that, in terms of loss of marriage, was that something you were worried might happen with you and James?
I was extremely worried because I felt I was outpacing him in my own religious deconstruction. And I thought he would be horrified when I said I wanted to leave the church. One of the churches we went to was particularly draconian, I felt, about women and didn't honour women's contribution. And it meant that abuse of women could go undetected and even flourish. And I discovered, to my enormous relief, that, because we didn't even dare talk about it, that he was on the same wavelength as me. And he was working for a Christian organisation. He was very unhappy in that Christian organisation. He could see the problems, and we both just gently and quietly talked about our disquiet, and we left the very controlling church and went to a more progressive church. But then leaving wasn't a dramatic thing. It's by stealth, because you don't want to attract attention or questions. So you just stop doing things. You stop leading Bible studies, you stop leading worship, singing. You just quietly drift off because you don't want to answer people's probing questions about where are you.
Have you maintained relationships with people that you were close to while you were that kind of Christian?
Oh, that's just such a good question and an incredibly sad question, because I did it first, but I felt that there was going to be the third degree, the kind of Spanish Inquisition about why I left. And I really didn't owe explanations to anybody, and I didn't really have a language to explain what had happened. Not really succinct, that I could answer all of the questions that they would pepper me with. Look, I had been on the other side of that, talking to the so-called backsliding Christian. I knew the questions that I would be asked, and I just didn't want to answer them. And some of those friends drifted off very, very quickly, and others just slowly. And I can only really think of one friend now that is still involved with the church, and I think that's really sad. But as I distance myself from them, they distance themselves from me.
How did things change in terms of your relationship with Dorothy after you stepped away from that Christianity?
Well, the thing is that I wasn't explicitly saying to her what was going on. I don't really think I knew myself what was going on. I just knew I was changing, and I was really scared to tell her because I thought she would say, well, come on, leave right now. And I couldn't leave until I was ready. And again, Dodd wanted to talk to me about her latest love affair. And Dodd wanted to talk to me once I really started taking my psychotherapy training seriously about herself and her life, because that's what interested her the most. Well, doesn't it interest all of us the most?
What was going on in her love life by this point, by her late 40s, early 50s?
Well, Dodd was at this point, when I was really on the way out with the church, Dodd was living with and very committed to the writer Andrea Goldsmith. But Dodd had an itch she wanted to scratch, and she loved passion, and she loved the fire of erotic experiences, and she went looking for them.
Did you think that was essential to her writing? Did the poetry and the passion go together in her
Well, she
mind?
certainly saw it that way for almost all her life. In her diaries, she was writing about her feelings and her passions inflaming her work from the earliest time, from her late teens. And I think that she thought that if she didn't have these experiences to fuel her muse and her extraordinary talent, that it might be taken from her like a gift, that the gods would take it away. And so she had to keep pouring petrol on that fire.
Josie, what do you remember about learning that Dorothy was sick?
Oh, look, I was horrified. I was absolutely horrified because she discovered she had breast cancer, and she had been very distracted by a particularly potent love affair, and my sense was that she was ignoring the changes in her body, and she was neglecting the normal things that we women need to keep a track of. And by the time it was diagnosed, it was advanced. And I was horrified, and I was annoyed, I was angry, because I thought this didn't have to be like this. But Dodd wasn't very body literate. She was, in her imagination, just running rampant through her own brain, and she just really wasn't noticing her own body in that way.
In that period after her first round of treatment, did the illness change her?
Well, she had, the very hefty treatment that you still need to have with advanced breast cancer, the surgery, the chemo, the radiotherapy, the daily tamoxifen. I know it's improved, but it is still a fairly brutal regime. And she did recover, and she did discover something about herself and her writing, in that she could write without these wild, passionate adventures. She could write. And a book that is many people's favourite is the one that she wrote during this time of recovery and her hope of remission, and that's The Bee Hut, which is got her verses about death and mortality and fear and waking up with a scar on your chest, climbing out of a black well, into a new life. But she did discover a stability and more settledness in her life. And I think she could grow in that. I think she could calm down and just rest in that.
That sickness came back. She lost her life in December 2008. What do you miss most about her now, all these years on?
Well, when she first died, I feared that I would lose my protector in the family. I felt still like an outsider in my own family. And I felt that she protected me from Chester. She protected me from, just kind of that sense of alienation and differentness in my family. She was such a wonderful support to me in sharing our grievances about the family. There's nothing better than talking to an adult sibling about your grievances, about your parents. And I just felt so bereft. And I visited a psychic, which only the desperately bereaved know the urgency to visit a psychic. I felt incredibly anxious about what was going to happen next, and I had to really pull myself together to recognise I really was a part of this family, and particularly pull together with Mary as my parents aged and eventually died. We had to do that. Now, what do I miss about her? I always wonder what she would say about current affairs. I want to discuss with her the state of the world. I want to ask her about ageing because, she'd be in her 70s. I want to talk to her about just she would talk to a big sister about. I want to talk to her about what it's like that our parents are dead. And, of course, what would she have written? But that's a path that you really shouldn't go down. That what would she be like and what would we be talking about and what would the books be? Because how can I know?
How did you get the idea or actually the sort of message to write this book about her and your family?
I had this incident when my mother broke her shoulder and Chester was not coping and he was angry and distressed and worried and taking it out on Mary and I. And I went for a walk and I thought, oh no, this is my future. This is where life is going. And I saw a kookaburra on this walk and I just looked at this kookaburra and the kookaburra said to me, write my story, Brad. And I thought, oh my God, I honestly believe I heard the voice of this kookaburra speak. Now, I'd never even thought of it before, but I actually think maybe I had been thinking about it. Because as you care for ageing parents, of course I was thinking about my big sister and wishing she was there and then glad she wasn't there because she would have worried and be ringing me all the time, asking me what was going on because she lived in Melbourne. And I think I was thinking a lot about her and nobody had come forward to write her biography. And I thought, well, I'll do it.
And it's appropriate that it was a kookaburra, I guess,
and
that said this to you.
A kookaburra is a messenger bird. And I think, like a willy wagtail, I think they can give us messages. And, of course, I'm a great bird lover. And I thought maybe it was her telling me to do it.
As well as all of Dorothy's published work, you drew on her diaries. Where did you go to read those, Josie?
Well, some of her diaries, the more recent ones, were in her possession when she died. So I was able to read those. But the early ones, those juicy, funny ones from when we were kids, and she started writing a diary when she was 14, mind you, they are all held in the Australian Defence Force Academy Library, ADFA.
How has this happened?
Oh, it's so funny. Well, in the 90s, ADFA was offering Australian writers money to store their works with them. And Dorothy was always very short of cash, and so they're there. And I loved ADFA. It's a tiny library with incredibly devoted, lovely librarians, one of whom came to my book launch in Sydney. So devoted, they absolutely loved it that I was there, trawling through these letters.
In what
diaries.
Sort of space were you reading them?
Well, there is a space dedicated to scholars coming and reading the papers that are stored in the library called the John Howard Reading Room.
It feels like a bit of a cosmic joke from Dorothy.
Look, it was a massive cosmic joke. And there were all these photos of John all around the walls, including his green Chesterfield lounges from Parliament House, which I would lie on and go outside to take a breather, and then all these white sulphur-crested cockatoos would just land squawking at my feet, and I thought, yes, Dot, I know, it's very, very funny.
Do you see her differently after having done this deep dive into her?
I do. Look, it's incredible because, you know, there's the Dodd who she was when she had cancer, when she was recovering and when she died. And then there's this Dodd that I have discovered, but also braided with my own memories. It's a privilege and a joy to explore somebody you love like this. I mean, I loved reading those diaries, and I remember at times some of the letters that Mary and I wrote to her were so illustrative and so illuminating of our lives at the time. And Mary and I both think that this book has kind of brought Dodd back to us. We feel closer to her, which, you know, is a joy to us.
How do you imagine your own life might have played out differently if you hadn't had Dorothy as your big sister?
I don't know. I don't think I would have survived the ravages of Chester's temper. I don't think I would have been able to perhaps find the courage to leave the church. Dorothy had really given me the courage by choosing a different path to mine. And I could choose a different path. And I did eventually find my own path. So if she hadn't loved me and noticed me, because I did feel very seen by her, I don't know. I mean, it's speculative, isn't it?
Thank you so much for sharing some of your story and your sisters on Conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's just been a delight.
Josie McSkimming's memoir is called Gutsy Girls. This story was produced by Nicola Harrison and recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. I'm Sarah Konoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Konoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Hello there, I'm Mark Fennell, and you may know me as the guy who finds the stuff that the British stole. Still doing that, but I'm also embarking now on a new hunt. This is a hunt for the people, the objects, the actions, the stuff-ups, the moments that essentially changed the course of history, but at the time, no one saw them coming. Each week, we will unravel stories from across the globe, from bizarre crimes you might never have heard of.
He's using the early 20th century equivalent of a high-vis vest and a lanyard to get into the Louvre undetected.
To brushes with death that changed science.
He sort of becomes like a boogeyman or a demon. Something you read, it sort of sends a chill down your spine.
You'll meet the people whose presence continues to be felt from the grave.
He imagined a secret society which would be watching the schools, the universities, to establish a worldwide English-speaking global elite.
There is no chapter of history that is off limits, and each and every one of these inflection points has somehow reshaped your life and my life.
I don't think this is talked about enough.
The outcome of World War II was not a foregone conclusion.
We think that restitution is a contemporary debate. It's really not. It's been going on forever.
No one saw it coming. Brand new episodes every Tuesday. You can listen on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Had Freud been alive at the time, he would have had a field day with all of this.